So I guess let's go back a little bit to the Bush administration and talk about their pretty much brazen ignorance about some of the ethnic gradations and the dynamics on the ground, including the installation of Hamad Karzai, which led to rampant corruption, including a heroin trade.
Right. Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things, the Taliban have rightly been accused of benefiting from the drug trade, but so did the U.S.-backed government. And in fact, the Hamid Karzai, who was the first president of Afghanistan, who the United States installed early on, largely because they thought since he was Pashtun, that would be a nice sop to the Pashtun community. Although he was from a pretty minor tribe and he wasn't considered a major Pashtun leader. But when he came in, one of the things he did was install his younger half-brother, Ahmed Wali Karzai, to be essentially the viceroy of southern Afghanistan. His official title, I believe, was deputy governor of Kandahar province, but that didn't explain who he really was and what his power was. He had enormous power for years over southern Afghanistan, and that meant he controlled the roads in and out of Afghanistan with Pakistan. And so he could control, in large measure, the Afghan heroin trade, which is enormous. I think Afghanistan today produces more than 80% of the world's heroin supply, and most of it is in southern Afghanistan, or a lot of it is. And so Ahmed Wali Karzai became the boss of the heroin trade, and the United States knew this. The Drug Enforcement Administration had evidence of Ahmed Wali Karzai's control over the business, but the Bush administration didn't want to do anything about it because they didn't want to upset the Karzais. They didn't want to get sidetracked in what they would consider being sidetracked from their essential counterterrorism role, but it was a total lack of understanding of the corruption that was growing in the new U.S.-backed government, and that was yet another reason why so many Afghans turned against the Karzai government and later the Ashraf Ghani government, because the corruption was so endemic and so built into the whole system that nobody trusted it. And it explains, I think, in large measure, why the Afghan army just collapsed overnight, because nobody felt any connection to the U.S.-backed central government.
Right. And a lot of that corruption was aided by the flood of U.S. money coming in that went into that heroin trade, went into the corruption, and, of course, went to defense contractors, which we can touch on as well, not necessarily to regular Afghans. Talk a little bit about that, if you could.
Yeah, I think the statistic that I think explains everything wrong about our involvement in Afghanistan is that we spent $145 billion on reconstruction in Afghanistan over 20 years. And the Afghan gross domestic product, as recently as 2019, was only 19 billion. If you do the math, that means our reconstruction was flooding and overwhelming and essentially the Afghan economy and turning it into this surreal bubble that made no sense whatsoever. And add to that the drug cash and the massive amounts of funding for combat operations. And you have this river of cash, American cash, flowing through there. And, the temptation for corruption was overwhelming. And so one of my favorite stories about Afghanistan is about how the founder of the Kabul Bank, which was the largest bank in Kabul after Karzai took over, basically he bought an airline just so he could move cash rapidly out of Kabul into Dubai and secret bank accounts for all of the powerful Afghans in Kabul. And they they allowed him to keep doing it because they were all benefiting from it. And so they looked the other way until his bank just totally collapsed because he had drained all of the depositors' money into his own secret real estate operations in Dubai.
How much of the perception of America was just like, these guys are rubes? I mean, they're flooding the country with cash. We're able to use it for our own ends, and it's really just about working the system there in order to get rich or invest in what I want to do. Like, because probably the Bush administration was so overwhelmingly focused on Iraq within not minutes, but basically right after getting into Afghanistan, there seemed to be no interest in creating anything sustainable, and thus it just was a slush fund that there's zero respect for what the Americans were trying to do.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, you got to remember that for Afghans, they've been at war basically for 40 years. And so war is their main industry. And taking advantage of foreign countries to get involved in Afghanistan is a long-standing tradition there. The Soviets, us, the British, and so this is basically how they knew how to make money, was scamming foreign countries trying to get involved in their war. It's a very sad commentary on Afghanistan, because it could have been done in different ways, but I think the first major mistake by the Bush administration was that they didn't really care about Afghanistan. They invaded it almost because they felt they had to, because that's where Al Qaeda was at the time, but they were never invested in it. They immediately wanted to go invade Iraq. In 2002 and 2003, they moved virtually all the key military assets out of Afghanistan so they could start the invasion of Iraq. And the Taliban had been dispersed by late 2001, early 2002. And the U.S. just pulled out, basically thinking, well, the war's over, when the war wasn't over. And they installed this government with Karzai as its head, but then never really did any oversight, any supervision, and just kept pouring money into it. And Congress, I think most people in Congress were afraid to say anything about it because they didn't want to look like they were doves, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. So they just kept writing these massive, massive checks for nothing. And it's one of the weirdest phenomenons in American history. I think to let that go on for 20 years is just unbelievable.
And it's to certain people's benefit, right? We touched on it a bit earlier, but it certainly benefited a certain class of defense contractors and very wealthy people in Washington.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the major benefit of the war on terror has been to enrich, to make real estate in Northern Virginia skyrocket in value. And in Southern California, the people like I mentioned Neil Blue, who runs General Atomics, which makes the Predator and the Reaper. I mean, there's just the numbers of contractors who have benefited, and subcontractors in Afghanistan is just it's mind-blowing, really.
Folks, there's more of what you've just saw where that came from. That's if you hit the subscribe and like button. Thank you. Really, thank you.